Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Civic Forum. My name is Rory Truex. For those who don't know me, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and the School of Public International Affairs at Princeton. I created the Civic Forum as a space for people to think and talk about the bigger picture issues facing democracy. This is not meant to be a Democrat or blue space or a Republican or red space, but a pro-democracy space. Today, our session is going to be focused on what we might call transnational authoritarianism, this idea that authoritarian models and practices that are innovated and pioneered in one country might make their way to another country. And in this instance, we're going to be talking about the case of Hungary and Viktor Orbán and the consolidation of power there, and then the relationship between Orbán's Fidesz Party and the GOP, and how some of the practices and the model that Orbán has put in place are being actively used in the United States today. Our speaker is a friend of mine, a colleague, Kim Lane Scheppele. Kim is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton. She comes here today, I should say, in her personal capacity, as do I. Her primary field is sociology of the law, and she works on the rise and fall of constitutional government. After 1989, she moved to Eastern Europe, where she lived in Hungary and Russia for extended periods, studying the way the new constitutions were being enacted and entrenched and ultimately eroded. So we're very lucky to have her today, and I'm going to bring her out now. Please join me in welcoming Kim Lane Scheppele. Hi, Kim. Thank you for coming.
Hi, nice to be here, although I wish it were a happier occasion.
Well, typically what we try to do is we go down the path of despair for a good 30 minutes, and then we try to end on a note of optimism. And I do think there are reasons to be optimistic.
Great, thanks so much. So the model that I think is most helpful at trying to understand what's happening in the U.S. today is precisely what happened in Hungary. Now, as Rory mentioned, I lived and worked in Hungary. I spent 4 years working at the Constitutional Court in Hungary in the 1990s, when Hungary was on its way up, becoming a democracy out of having been what we used to call a Soviet satellite state. And Hungary became actually a seriously entrenched democracy, which is why when you see it fall apart, you realize that it can happen anywhere. So Viktor Orbán came to power it's the second time actually, in 2010. And like the second Trump administration, when Orbán was in power the first time, as when Trump was in power the first time, he tried to capture some of the institutions of state, but he wasn't organized enough or powerful to do it all. And so when Orbán came back the second time, as when Trump has now come back the second time, Orbán came in with a plan. He had spent his time out of office actually drafting, a huge program for how it is that you take over and crash a democracy, legally speaking. And he came into power in May of 2010, and by 3 years later, Hungary was a dictatorship. It all happened very fast. So let me just mention a couple of the things that Orbán did at the very beginning that may sound familiar here. So one was that he came into power and immediately decided that in order to get the kind of state on side, so to speak, in order to get the bureaucracy to go along with what he was going to do, he suspended the civil service laws and mass fired state employees. Now, at the time, Hungary was under an IMF austerity program, International Monetary Fund. State had gone bankrupt. The lender of last resort had come in, said you have to cut the national budget. He did all of this under cover of cutting the national budget. We don't have that here, but firing civil servants en masse might sound familiar. So he did all of that. It meant that a lot of people who were working for government either quit because they saw what was coming, or they were afraid of speaking out against what was happening because they would lose their jobs. So mass firing civil servants. Second thing was that while he was out of power, he and his people had studied in detail the national budget and thought about what are all the ways in which the national budget pays for and supports people who are going to resist what it is I'm going to do. And they went through and they targeted like all of these places where the national budget was supporting people who could be in the opposition. So it turns out in Hungary, many of the civil sector groups were supported by national grants. All of those were cut overnight, leaving the entire, NGO, civil society sector reeling. it turns out that many of the independent media in Hungary were supported by advertising from the state. Overnight, cut all the state advertising to all of the opposition and independent news outlets so that suddenly they suffered this massive, fiscal crisis. He also did the same with universities. In the first couple of years he was in power, he cut university budgets because, again, in Hungary, like in much of Europe, almost all the universities are public universities. Orbán cut the university budgets by 40% in the first couple of years. And again, you just go on and on through every single part of Hungarian society that was dependent on resources from the national budget, and overnight just cut them without warning and sent that whole and basically disabled the political opposition so that it was hard for them to mobilize to stand up to him. And then the third thing he did was to take aim at the highest court in the country, which was the Constitutional Court. I must say I have a rather fond spot in my heart for that court because I worked there for 4 years. We built up this really world-renowned and quite distinctive jurisprudence underwriting a constitutional democracy. And Orbán changed the system for appointing judges, and he expanded the number of judges on the court. And within 3 years, that court was completely captured by Orbán loyalists. And to make matters worse, they even amended the constitution to say that the entire jurisprudence of that court, all the decisions that court had made from 1990 when it was started till 2011 when Orbán brought in his new constitution, all those decisions were just canceled overnight. So this combination of bringing the civil sector into line, cutting everything that could be supported by the national budget, and capturing the courts so that nobody would tell you that what you were doing was unconstitutional, were the opening moves in a salvo that went on to cover more and more things. With my last 1 minute, if I can, I think, Rory, I'm
Oh, you
trying
have
to
more.
stay
You
on
have more time. Yeah, you keep
Oh,
going.
I do? Okay, well,
Yeah.
so then let me just say, if all of that sounds familiar, it's not actually a coincidence. And, I always have to say, look, I'm not really a crazy cat lady, like finding conspiracies everywhere. I'm actually an anti-conspiracy theory kind of person. But it turns out that Orbán's people were actually involved in writing Project 2025, which was the blueprint with which Trump came into office, hit the ground running, and really has carried out this massive blitz on basically all the bastions of democratic constitutionalism in the United States. So Orbán wanted to export what he had done. And, Orbán spends about 1% of Hungarian GDP, which is a lot of money in a national budget. He spends that on this institution. The mothership is called the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which is this huge thing that's a cross between a boot camp and a university and a think tank. They do everything from producing fake polls to producing all kinds of ideological documents to training the next cadres of civil servants loyal to Orbán. There's a subsidiary of that group called the Danube Institute. You can Google it. It's the English language think tank paid for by Orbán. And Trump's people have been cycling through Danube, getting training in how to do this. And the Danube Institute made they have a formal memorandum of understanding with Heritage to participate in crafting Project 2025. Again, the blueprint for what we're seeing here in the US. When I read Project 2025, not knowing this backstory, by the way, the first thing I thought of was, wow, how did they guess some of the infrastructure that Orbán used, particularly this weaponization of the national budget right at the start? And then I was talking to a lot of journalists, said, this is really suspiciously similar. And some of them poked around and actually discovered this memorandum of understanding and the formal agreement. So what we're seeing here in the US is not just kind of borrowing in some theoretical way from what happened in Hungary, but Orbán's folks have been in the trenches actually building the program that we see.
Thank you, Kim, for those opening remarks. So I want to cover Trump eventually, but I think we should spend a little bit more time talking about Orbán and give people a sense of what this type of system feels like. So when people think about authoritarianism or dictatorship, they think North Korea, they think China, and there's this kind of muddy middle category, what we would call electoral autocracy or competitive authoritarianism. There's different fancy academic labels. So these are systems where democracy has basically been eroded, often through legal means, and elections once were free and fair, but aren't anymore. opposition is targeted, violence is sort of lurking in the background. Could you tell us a little bit more about what an election in Hungary feels like today? There's one coming up. What does it feel like to live in an electoral autocracy like this? Can you give us a little more color there?
Yeah. So it's true that if what you expect with autocracy is tanks in the streets, I mean, actually, we are having some tanks in the streets today if you look at DC, but usually these days, what autocrats do is they don't resort to violence early on. Again, the Trump phenomenon is a little bit different in some of these ways, but in Hungary, Orban's takeover of all of the institutions of democratic government occurred without any overt violence coming from the state itself. And so, of course, they went on having regular elections. If you go to Hungary during an election campaign, there are competing political parties. You'll see a fair amount of activity. Every election, the opposition actually thinks it might win. But what Orban does, and again, what the new autocrats typically do, is instead of violence, they use law. And so what they do, and Orban, since he was elected in 2010, has rigged every single election since 2014, 2018, 2022, and now there's an election next April, and we can see the rigging happening in real sight. So what do I mean by rigging? Well, when Orban first came to power in 2010, the first thing he did, actually with the support of the political opposition in parliament, was to say, we've got this parliament that's 475 or so people. It's a country of 10 million people. We don't need a parliament that big. So why don't we cut the number in half? We'll save money. We'll have, we'll more rationally design all the districts. Everybody voted for it. And then what happened was that then I think the opposition realized, oh, now Orban draws all the districts. So it turns out in the election of 2014, gerrymandering. Orban wins 43% of the vote, and he gets 80+% of the districts. So, and then every subsequent election, he changes the rules depending on the opposition strategy. So there's no way that they can win. And he's doing that again for next year.
Well, and this is interesting because when you read the headlines, it seems that there is some opposition. He's actually down in the polls to a younger candidate who defected from Fidesz, his party. And so there's this chatter in the ether that is it the end for Orban, or is he going to pull one more rabbit out of the hat and figure out a way to rig another election? I think the way I understand it, and I want to hear your thoughts, is in these systems, the dictator can lose, but it just requires almost like a lightning strike, right? So it's just they have to lose in such a landslide that they would actually, and then they have to somehow honor the result. And we haven't even talked about that. They can just say it was rigged, right? So, looking ahead to 2026, is there any optimism that we might see a turnover?
Well, so this new challenger, Peter Magyar, literally came out of the woodwork, out of Orban's party, and so he knows where all the bodies are buried, and he's been very clever at the way in which he's attracted huge amounts of popular support. So the good news is that he's 10 to 15% ahead in the polls, the real polls, as opposed to the manufactured polls the government puts out. And the whole opposition, there were a number of other political parties. They've all kind of collapsed because everybody's standing behind this guy. This guy is no liberal in social, in policy terms. He may not be a liberal in democratic terms either. It's a little hard to tell. So, it's not a robust opposition that necessarily will give you less autocracy, in my view. Okay, so what's going to happen? So already Orban's going after him with all the guns blazing. They've already passed one big law through the parliament that made 300 little changes to the current election law. In particular, what they've done is take seats away from the parts of the country where Magyar is running stronger and giving them to their own people. So again, that they're talking about creating election districts in the neighboring countries where there are lots of Hungarian citizens over the border. And the election commission, which Orban controls, has already said they're not even going to look at what happens there. So if they have these election districts, there will be no oversight. And those are districts that, and there's not districts, but people can vote remotely. And the vote from those districts so far has been 95% Orban. So they're just going to increase the weight of people voting outside the country. And then what they're also doing is they're They are starting criminal proceedings against Peter Magyar. He has a short temper. Somebody provoked him into a barroom brawl. He threw a person's phone into the Danube River. Now there's criminal charges against him. They put him under investigation. They've got all kinds of, he's under complete surveillance. So if he says anything on his cell phone or in any meeting that makes him look bad, the next thing you know is the recordings out on social media. So they're really using all kinds of tactics to try to make sure his brand is tarnished, or perhaps he can't even run as a candidate by next April's election.
I mean, it's also striking to people, and I felt the same way about Navalny, seeing him operate in Russian society. You have these opposition figures that are charismatic, that draw large parts of the population. Often they're running on kind of an anti-corruption platform, kind of anti-establishment, anti-corruption, which is popular because these regimes are inherently corrupt. And they're allowed to persist for longer than you might think. I mean, I'm a China scholar, so the idea that someone like this would emerge in China is impossible. So it's interesting that rather than just throw him in jail immediately, they are kind of playing this game of almost delegitimizing him, or trying to just, because there could be a backlash, right? So if you went that far, there's the possibility of revolution, unrest, and so forth. So is that a correct assessment, that there's a bound to how repressive Orbán can be in this type of situation?
Yeah, and so I think remember that Orbán's also a member of some of the most exclusive clubs in the world. So he's a member of the European Union. And until recently, the EU was funding Orbán's government. Now, finally, this is what I've been doing the last 15 years, is trying to get the EU to cut the funds to Hungary. They finally cut a lot of Hungary's funds in 2022. It was exactly that enabled Magyar to spring out of Orbán's woodwork, so to speak, and challenge him, because this suddenly became visible that the state didn't have the money to pay off all their supporters anymore. Okay, so Orbán is actually limited by the fact that he's in the EU. He can't just look like, Xi in China. He can't just look like that kind of dictator. So it's important to have the appearance of free and fair elections without any of the results that would come from free and fair elections. So Orbán then just tends to manipulate the electoral system. He uses his, 80% of the Hungarian media are under Orbán's control. So you get this massive anti-Peter Magyar, anti-publicity campaign and so on. So they're going to use all the tools at their disposal to try to discredit him. But, so far it hasn't worked. That's what's really interesting. And so I think we'll see Orbán getting more and more desperate and resorting to more and more overtly unacceptable tactics.
I think what's also important for people to understand is that there's inherent ambiguity in this type of government, and political scientists, social scientists would look at Hungary and call this dictatorship or authoritarian. We would label it as such.
Yeah.
But in Hungarian society, in certain circles, or certainly in international society, that is contested, right? So Orbán is trying to depict himself as just a traditional family values, hardline conservative. And that's why he can be welcomed into places like CPAC and other places like this, right? So he's this ambiguity between authoritarian and just sort of traditional conservative. And also we know authoritarian could be on the left too. So I'm not trying to give the left a pass here, but how does he manage to do that? I mean, I remember seeing Orbán when the Republican Party started to praise Orbán, when he said Trump talking about Orbán openly and not with contempt. To me, that was another red flag, because for so many of us, he's just this dictatorial figure.
Yeah. So if you live in Hungary, it's a very light dictatorship. And if you stay away from politics, they stay away from you, right? So literally you go about your daily life. If you work in the private sector, you don't really have any intersection with the state. Things don't feel all that different from the way they felt before Orbán came to power. So it's a very light touch dictatorship on the ground. As soon as you stand up to him, however, then you feel, the full force of all of this. So it's a light touch dictatorship, and it has to be in order to stay in good graces, sort of the EU, but also the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, etc. Okay. Now, a lot of Orbán's rhetoric, which mirrors, the Republican Party in the United States, is designed actually not so much for domestic consumption as it is for foreign consumption. So when Orbán, he rewrote the Constitution, I forgot to say, in the first year. It came out with this new Constitution, took effect January 1st, 2012. what was featured in there was fetal rights from the moment of conception. Okay, and Orbán sends this constitution around to pro-life members of the U.S. Congress, who then say, "This is our kind of guy," right? And then he comes out against genders, plural, like, they have the father is a man, the mother is a woman of every, whatever, like all this kind of anti-gender fluidity rhetoric. They've come out, they allegedly banned the Pride Parade this year, which meant that it was the biggest parade ever. Anyway, they've done all that kind of stuff, but in Hungary, there's very little sign of all this. So they put fetal rights into the constitution, never changed the abortion law, which is more or less the same as the abortion law across Europe. They put in all of this kind of anti-gender language. Didn't have that much of an effect until this year when Orbán tried to ban the Pride Parade. And by that time, the European Parliament sent members, all these folks came from all over Europe, biggest demonstration we've had in Hungary since the end of the Cold War. So that was the ban, right? So in other words, it's a very light touch dictatorship in which the far right rhetoric is not actually matched on the ground with repression. Because if it were, then there would be much more resistance to Orbán. So the rhetoric is designed to build a kind of right-wing movement within Europe and to attract the support of the U.S. Republican Party. But it's not what you feel on the ground when you're there.
No, and that's a phrase that I think has been used. I think Steve Levitsky used it in a piece, in an interview at one point, calling it sort of some form of soft dictatorship, soft authoritarianism in the U.S. right now. And soft implies cozy almost, but it's
like
soft.
A big pillow.
Well, soft authoritarianism is still authoritarianism. And it's interesting. Right. You talk to people here, there's a feeling of unease. Am I still allowed to protest? Should I wear a mask when I protest to avoid, facial recognition? Like, we're at the point now where people are beginning to feel a little bit of that chill and that uncertainty. And I think that's indicative of that turn.
Exactly.
I do want to, oh, sorry. Yeah.
But in daily life, if you're not involved in protests and you're not involved in politics and your job hasn't been defunded or canceled by the government, not that much has changed yet. Right. And that's the secret to how this works, is that for the vast majority of people, if you're just at some distance from politics and not really looking closely, it looks today like it looked a year ago.
I want to turn actually directly to the U.S. now.
Sure.
And in one of your talks earlier in the year, you talked a little bit about how Hungary and the kind of institutions there were sort of relatively easy to topple in some sense, that it was easy to make a constitutional change. It's a unicameral system. And now we look at the US, and this is a country with centuries of democratic tradition, depending on how you start the count. But we have a strong democratic tradition. We have a bicameral system. There's a lot of veto players in the system, strong courts, strong civil society. There's a lot of sources of democratic resilience. And you see the Trump team sort of copying the playbook. They're attacking universities. They're going after civil servants. They're trying to do the courts. But they can't do the things that Orbán did, right? Trump would love to have the size of Congress and redraw all the districts. He would love to put in a retirement age for judges and then knock it down and take out the people. Like, he can't do what Orbán did. And so do you think he's still as effective, or is it just sort of a muted version of the Orbán model?
Yeah, well, as these ideas travel around the world, they have to adapt to the political system that they come into, and you're right to say that not only did Hungary only have one house of parliament, but it's a parliamentary system, which means the parliament elects the executive. So the executive and the legislature are far more fused in those kinds of systems than they are in a presidential system like ours. So then how do you adapt that to here? So if you look at the American system of separation of powers, the assumption goes all the way through our Constitution, that every official will protect the institution that they're part of. So the Senate will jealously guard the privileges of the Senate, and ditto with the House, and ditto with the courts, and ditto with the states, because we have a federal system, which Hungary does not have. Okay, now the thing is that it didn't start with Trump, but gradually over the last 30 years or so, maybe 40, as polarization has increased in the US, increasingly elected officials and judges and everyone else in the political system no longer are primarily the stewards of their institutions. They're members of the red team and the blue team, which is to say that members of Congress, when their own party is in power, will tend to go along and support and defend that president when the president's of an opposition party. Then Congress acts like Congress, right? And so what it means is that separation of powers has kind of devolved in favor of what some of my colleagues at NYU Law School call separation of parties.
Mhm.
And if every single official thinks of themselves primarily as a red team or blue team member, then the safeguards in our constitutional system disappear. And we've seen already here that where's Congress? As the president takes away lots of Congress's power to set up agencies, to create conditions for, to create the qualifications for who serves in those agencies, to spend the money Congress has appropriated, Trump has blown past all those things which the Constitution gives to Congress as its primary responsibilities. And yet Congress has said nothing. Trump has actually also been resisting court orders. There was a Washington Post story a couple of weeks ago that says that I think it was a third of all the cases where Trump has been ordered, the Trump administration has been ordered to do something. They've either evaded or backtracked or dragged their feet or whatever. So they're not, and the Solicitor General, the chief person in the Department of Justice who argues before the Supreme Court, literally went into the Supreme Court on that birthright citizenship universal injunction case and said, Your Honors, we believe that the executive branch is not bound to follow decisions of the lower courts, only of the Supreme Court, Your Honors. Okay, so we're seeing the collapse of separation of powers. And as long as the judges and members of Congress, and for that matter, governors, are playing on one team or the other, the safeguards in our constitutional system are really weakened. So where's the resilience? The answer is blue states, blue state attorneys general. They've been bringing a lot of the cases. So, again, it's a kind of red-blue, you need resistance to come out of the blue camp. And unfortunately, that makes everything look partisan, right? And you said at the beginning, your series here is not meant to support one side or the other in a partisan battle, right? And that's where every time I talk about this, I say, this is really a democracy-autocracy battle, right? And you got to play on the democracy team, whatever that is. And unfortunately, in the US now, that simply looks like the blue team. And we have to get over that. And frankly, I'm spending a lot of my time these days hanging out with the people I call homeless Republicans who lost their party, right? And they're very often on the front lines of this pro-democracy defense because they realize that you can't have one party that believes in the constitutional system and another party trying to crash it. You need competition among parties that are all, as the Germans would say, system parties, right? All committed to preserving the constitutional order. And right now we don't have that.
No, and I said this the other day at a talk, but I think it's worth just saying, how difficult it is for people to defect from their party, right? So if you're a Republican and you have conservative values, to say what Trump is doing is authoritarian and this is not okay, even though it's in line with my policy preferences, that's a really challenging thing for people to do. And I think those people deserve real praise from everybody. And it's a sacrifice very few people ever have to make in their life. But we can think of that at the political level, people like a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger. We can think about just people in society, people running the Bulwark, all these other things, people, the Lincoln Project Republicans. That's a really important force in this moment. And I think it's sometimes we don't praise those people enough for what they did, because it takes real courage, because they tank their political careers and they subject themselves to violent threats, right? And that's another piece of this that we haven't really talked about, this sort of background violent conditions. That was the closest I get to a rant, Kim. It's pretty low energy. Oh, sorry.
No. But if I can amplify on the violence part, so there is a ton of violence going on in a subterranean manner until we've got these tanks in the streets in Los Angeles and Washington, which is a slightly different kind of issue here, and ICE, of course, and all the grabbing people off the streets who look like they're not U.S. citizens. But members of Congress, particularly the Republicans, are getting threats against themselves and against their families. And quite a few of them have come out and said, look, I can't subject my family to this. We're seeing threats to federal judges. I don't know if you've heard about the pizza boxes, but one thing that's happening, I know pizza doesn't sound like the most threatening thing in the budding autocracy, but members of Congress, people in the opposition, and particularly federal judges are having their doorbell ring in the evening and there's a pizza delivery guy saying, "Hi, free pizza." And then with the federal judges in particular, there have been at least 60 cases of this where the judges take the pizza, and the pizza comes from someone called Daniel Salas. Okay, now Daniel Salas was the son of a federal judge named Esther Salas here in New Jersey. A disgruntled litigant came to Esther Salas's house one evening. Her son opened the door and was shot dead at point blank range on her doorstep. These pizzas that are going to federal judges that are disagreeing with Trump come in the name of Esther Salas's murdered son. Everybody knows it's a threat. And when it comes to your house, it says, "We know where you live." So that's something happening in the background here. And still, the federal judges are standing up. Members of Congress, not so much. And this is where we have to say that a lot of the Marshal Service that protects them all is under the command of the Department of Justice, which is now a partisan operation. So we all have to worry about what happens to the protection of people who stand up to Trump. So that's the really dark side of this force that we don't all see, but it's there.
Well, and one thing you've said in your earlier remarks in other settings is that these regimes aren't often explicitly engaging in violence themselves. They're making way for violence by removing
Exactly.
removing
Exactly. And
security,
that,
removing, and
yeah,
that's so it's again a plausible deniability thing for them.
exactly. But this is where, again, Trump is sort of deviating from the playbook I've been following. So in places like Hungary or in Poland or even in Russia or in Venezuela or in Ecuador, like when they were going through their autocratic consolidations, I always put in the Latin American ones because those were left-wing ones. Even Bolsonaro in Brazil, another right-wing leader, they usually don't lead with violence because then everybody knows you're in a dictatorship, right? That's what people expect. So they usually don't lead with it. And this is where I've been really, and what happened in Hungary is that um, Orban would withdraw the police, and then his football hooligans would go in and beat up people or threaten people or whatever. And then the police would show up and say, "Oh, we have no idea who did that. The CCTV cameras were off. We have no leads. They were all wearing masks. Can't find them." And so there'd be this private violence, that would be permitted by the pullback of official state, civil society, or like, police, let's say. Here, what we're seeing is something quite different because the threats are really visible. I mean, if you're in these institutions that are standing up to Trump, you see the threats every day. And now, with the immigration raids and with these crackdowns on blue cities that are allegedly, dens of iniquity or dens of crime, we're seeing actually the military being put on the streets. That's really unusual. And it is generating resistance. If you saw last night in DC, there were all these people out in the streets, photographing the military, the police, and so on. But it's quite unusual in these soft authoritarian regimes to see so much overt display of military and police violence and presence. So this is a little off script.
Well, and I think there's a risk to Trump, of course, of if you push things too far. Uh, there's theories in political science that little bits of repression can actually backfire because they mobilize people, and so
Exactly.
this is heightening people's reflexes. I think it's the authoritarian nature of this government is just becoming more apparent by the day. I wanted to talk about how do you combat an authoritarian political party without becoming authoritarian yourself, right? So that the or not authoritarian, but like
Yeah,
what
yeah,
do you
yeah.
what do you do when you're playing a game and you're trying to play by the rules and the other person's cheating, or trying to cheat or trying to just get rid of the rules completely? And we look at Texas, and then there's this response. So the Democrats are going to gerrymander California in response, and then it will be this kind of tit for tat. So the whole country is fully gerrymandered, and we have no good representation, and people really hate Congress and have no electoral accountability. So obviously, this is not how the system should work.
Right.
But I say this because you spend enough time on X and other platforms that are leaning conservative. There is this
Mhm.
kind of counter narrative that the Democrats are the problem. They tried to throw Trump in jail. They tried to take our candidate and get him on trumped up charges about everything in New York. Like there's a narrative that the Democrats are the ones that are breaking the rules and trying to get. And so I'm
Right.
wondering how you think about how does one deal with a party like this?
Right. Well, let me first say how I worked on this in Hungary and then explain how we can try to do that here. So, Hungary, like I said, is a member of a lot of exclusive clubs. They're in the European Union, Council of Europe, and those are international organizations, transnational organizations that actually have standards for what's an independent judiciary, what does democracy look like, what are free and fair elections. In other words, there were standards that Hungary had signed on to through treaty. So there are legally binding obligations inside Hungary that Orban's autocracy pulled them away from. So my argument, in fact, I've been working with the political opposition in Hungary on some of this, particularly in the last election. Um, I said, well, look, you're going to have to come in and dismantle this stuff, and it's so entrenched that you may have to break the law to make the law, right? And how do you justify that as being different from what they did? So what I said in Hungary, and the opposition, I was pleased to see, adopted this strategy. You say, look, we're going to restore the rule of law as it's known in the rest of Europe. We have external standards. We're going to bring in advisors who will say, are you moving toward those standards or away from them? Prior government moved away from them. We are still under the rule of law, right? But it's the rule of law from these transnational standards that we're going to move back toward. We will subject ourselves to external monitors who can reassure the public that we're on that track. And then we may have to break our law to do that. But it's breaking domestic law in the service of transnational law. Okay, so that worked in Hungary. The U.S. never signs a treaty that gives
I
those
can't.
to us, right?
Yeah, we're not going to have a bunch of Europeans coming in here telling us what to do.
Exactly. So
You
I
know.
see that. So I think what the opposition needs to do is to say, look, here are the standards we believe in. We are restoring democracy. Here's what it will look like. And to have, to think of maybe some of these homeless Republicans, a bipartisan panel, right, of people that are across the US political spectrum to be the monitors of this transition, right? To say what is the Democratic Party, or what is, whatever grows out of the opposition to this, might be a fusion party of some kind, right? What is that group going to be able to do to restore democracy that meets the standards they laid out when they campaign in an election, right? How can they be held to a rule of law standard that isn't the law these guys just created, right? Because they're subverting the law itself. And so I think that's kind of the answer, right? You need to show that whoever it is that's doing the response isn't just doing it tit for tat, right? That they're actually held to account under some principles they don't control by independent monitors who can say that this isn't just a partisan grab to tilt the balance of power in the opposite direction, but it really does try to restore democratic institutions.
No, and we were talking with Ruth Ben-Ghiat a
Mm-hmm.
couple weeks ago, and I think this feeling that the political system prior to Trump was headed in a difficult direction and wasn't working for people. The confidence in
Mm-hmm.
government in the U.S. has been trending downward since the
Mm-hmm.
1970s, and so there's this feeling of despair, and Trump capitalizing on that despair. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm increasingly feeling a longer term optimism, because I think one thing that Trump is doing is just exposing, just to the naked eye, everything that's wrong with our system: the influence of billionaires and money in politics, the lack of transparency, the gerrymandering. Like, so all of these, they're just so front and center. And I'm
Right.
hearing conversations online about proportional representation and multi-member districts, like things that, these are like
Yeah.
theoretical questions that are just
Right.
seem fantastical. But I think there could be a more serious conversation about political reform, and
Exactly.
how do we improve our institutions to have better representation and better democracy moving forward. So that's kind of my longer term
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah.
I want to bring in a couple questions from the audience. There's one
Sure.
that's very open ended, but based on what you've observed in Hungary and the Orban model, how does this movie play out in the U.S.? You do have this uncanny ability to see the future by looking at the past. So, what do you see looking ahead? I mean, I think what's interesting is Trump is unpopular, right? He's not Bukele. He's
Mhm.
not popular. The kind of economic problems are already there. It took them a while to materialize in Hungary. Vance is an interesting character in that I think the longer he hangs around and Trump's dirty laundry just gets all over him, it's going to sully his chances to be president someday. And so there's this. I've been wondering, is Trump even going to make it 4 years, or is there going to be some sort of internal move to get him out? Because he's, in some sense, what you've hinted at is another thing I want. This is a question that's 5 parts now, but I'll finish it soon. is this idea that it's not really about Trump. Trump is the catalyst for a broader set of policies coming out of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. And it could easily be someone like J.D. Vance at the helm. And in some sense, he's a much more reliable puppet for this type of agenda. So how do you see this? What are you seeing in the next few years to come?
Yeah, so the short term, well, I had a student once write on a paper, we should think about the short run because the long run can last for 25 years. So what do we do? So first of all, you can't have a democracy without competing system allegiant parties, right? So one of the most urgent things to do is to create a conservative party that still believes in the constitutional system, right? Now, that's hard in a two-party system because third parties, maybe you can split the conservative vote and then the Democrats win and so on. But you need to rethink like what the options are, right? And I think one really urgent thing is to figure out how to develop, a conservative party that respects rule of law and constitutionalism. I also think that what's going to wind up happening in the short term is that federalism is going to be our friend, that we're going to be able to preserve at least some forms of serious democracy in the blue states that have not yet been corrupted, and potentially in some of the red states, because if you look at the consequences of some of the policies that Trump has already put in place, the red states are going to feel really the brunt of it, and it's like he's almost trying to kill off his own supporters in a lot of ways. So I think that what we need to do in the short term is try to focus on building up federalism as a form of resistance, and federalism as a laboratory for a new party structure that eventually, this is longer term, can sort of go national. Federalism also means leaning into state courts, because one of the things I'm really terrified about is that this Supreme Court so far has given Trump everything he's wanted and more. And they've had 18 cases so far since January arising out of the Trump chaos, and in every single case, they've given him more than he wanted. Okay, so the federal courts are not going to save us. The U.S. Congress is so far not, shall we say, a powerful force. So federalism is one thing, trying to develop alternative structures, trying to figure out how to imagine a future that these alternative parties can run on, sort of for some. So now that's, right now it just feels like a fantasy, right?
Well, can you be specific there? So, you're talking about potentially, I agree with you that the only way out of this in the longer run is for the Republican Party to be basically realigned, and the sort of John McCain's and Mitt Romney's and Liz Cheney's of the world to come back into power, and the shame and the stain of the Trump administration. And Ruth talked about this as well, is that parties that do what the GOP is doing now do not fare well in the long historical run, right? So that, to me, like we need the Republican Party to come back to their senses. But how does that exactly interact?
How do you do it? Okay. Yeah. So concretely, I've been part of the fusion voting movement. So the U.S. used to have something called fusion voting in almost every state before the dominant parties canceled it. What is fusion voting? Fusion voting, in fact, New Jersey is the ground zero for that, and my district, New Jersey 7, is the ground zero for that. And what is fusion voting? It means that you have multiple parties, but you may only have two candidates that are running, because in our first past the post system, a third party is a spoiler, and anyway, it has unpredictable and often negative consequences. So what you would get in my district, New Jersey 3, where we had Tom Malinowski for a few cycles before we now have Tom Kean Jr., there would be a party formed. It was already formed in my county, called the Moderate Party. And the Moderate Party would be the homeless Republicans. And what they would do is they would endorse the Democratic challenger, okay, because they don't want the Trumpist candidate. They endorse the Democratic challenger. What you then get is that Tom Malinowski used to be, we'll have somebody new this next round, will be the Democratic candidate, and they'll get two streams of votes. One is traditional Democratic Party votes, the other is Moderate Party votes. And the strength of the Moderate Party votes becomes a real lobbying factor that you can then use to moderate the policies of the Democratic candidate to move more in a centrist direction, right? Because that becomes a voting bloc that this particular candidate owes allegiance to. If you have that in the interim, where you develop these homeless Republican parties that will endorse Democratic candidates, because right now that's the only option in a two-party system. But you create a party structure and a voting bloc that pulls the Democratic candidates more toward the center. Then you're building a party, and you're also building kind of a movement around a more centrist approach to politics that's likely to be, I mean, how to put it? Is the far left of the Democratic Party going to want that? No. On the other hand, they've also got to realize, as we all do, that first you vote for democracy, and then you can go back to voting left, right. Okay. So that way, I mean, if you do fusion voting, you're building up the opposition party within the current two-party structure. And then perhaps that moderate party becomes strong enough to break free and have a conservative candidate that would win over, the Republican Trumpist candidates. I think that's the only realistic.
No, I think it's really a compelling idea that so you understand the fact that a third party cannot compete right away, but it can pull votes, and so using that to negotiate basically with the Democratic candidate and pull them a little bit closer to your policy position, and then build strength over time. I mean, that's more plausible because it doesn't require constitutional change. It doesn't require changes, redistricting, and a lot of the other proposals you see out there, like ranked choice voting or proportional representation, like those are big old changes. And so this one is really more of a tactic than anything else.
In fact, there's a group called Protect Democracy, which is a bipartisan group interested in democratic reform. And they have a section on fusion voting, which I think is actually the only way you can realistically do things in a two-party system like today.
I want to close by, we've been doing with a lot of our speakers. I think people are struggling with what they can personally do in this moment. And so you don't need to give us the 15-point plan, but just one or two things that you've seen, because you have studied opposition, right? And so what do you think is important for people to do, just normal citizens to do?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to do is not give up, right? And democracy is worth fighting for. And one of the ways you do that is you do it first at local level. So one of the reasons why, if you've seen, the opposition's been organizing, not the one massive demonstration in Washington, but lots of small demonstrations across the country, is you need to find out who in your community is worried about what's happening. And you need to set aside whatever your partisan affiliations were going into this, and to figure out how can you build resilience at the level of the town, of the neighborhood, of the city, and of the state, and work up from the bottom. One thing I work on Hungary, but I teach, historical examples too. And when Germany was rebuilt after World War II, what I was always so struck by is that they didn't start with revising a national constitution under occupation. They started with local elections, and then 2 years later had state level elections. And then 2 years after that, started drafting a national constitution. They built ground up, and they did it because you know who your neighbors are. You know if they're trustworthy, you know who they are independent of. You may have more reasons to know them than their party affiliation. And so everyone can build a ground up at creating civil sector organizations, supporting those. You don't need to persuade people who are supporting the autocratic move. Find people who are worried about what's happening and talk to them about the dangers rather than about a political program right at the start. So, again, building up civil society ground up is the best resilience. And that's something everyone can do, even if they haven't previously been involved in politics.
Well, I think what you're hinting at is this idea that kind of human to human connection it's kind of cheesy to say, but human to human connection is the foundation of democracy, because it leads to trust, it leads to cooperation, and we just know it has these big benefits. And there's been a lot of discussion about how we're all online community, if we can, is not really community is community,
Right.
face-to-face community, and we've lost that. There's a lot of data to say that, well, civil society or these organizations have suffered, especially in the post-pandemic period. So now is the time to just reconnect with people in your community, and in doing that, I think that does have sort of this externality of improving trust and building that resilience to democracy. So see, we got to our little note of optimism. It took us 50 minutes this time, but please join me, everybody, virtually in thanking Kim Lane Scheppele for sharing her expertise today. thank you again for coming to the Civic Forum, and hope to see you next week. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.